Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited for this conversation. Um, we set this up really as an opportunity for other metropolitans to sort of learn what's happening in Chicago and to really learn from the ways in which they've been able to build sort of this local news media ecosystem that has all this innovation and is really leading the way when it comes to journalism that is engaging, that is grounded, a collaborative journalism. There's so much to learn from what's happening in Chicago. So with me on stage today, I'm just going to do a quick round of introductions, but remember in the program booklet, you can learn more about our speakers and their bios and their Twitter handles. But for now, I'll just be brief because we're going to jump right into the conversation. At the very end, there will be time for Q&A. So throughout the session, if you look to the right where you're chatting right now, there's a tab called Q&A and polls. You can drop your questions there that we'll bring to the panelists at the very end of today's conversation. So on the stage with me is Bettina Chang. She is the co-executive director at City Bureau, a journalism lab imagining local media by informing, engaging, and equipping people to eliminate information inequity. Hi, Bettina. Also joining me is Nissa Rhee. She is the executive director and co-founder of Borderless magazine, a member-supported and multilingual newsroom that is reimagining immigration journalism for a more just and equitable future. Also here is Tracy Brown, Chief Content Officer at WBEZ, Chicago Public Media. That is Chicago's NPR news station, which is one of the largest and most respected public media stations in the country. And Nykia Wright, CEO of the Chicago Sun-Times, a daily newspaper that began in 1948 and was recently acquired by Chicago Public Media. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so just a little context for the folks in the room. Outside of New York in the Bay Area, Chicago has one of the greatest number of INN members in any one single metropolitan area with more than 18 newsrooms. And if you were to filter the list of local newsrooms, it has actually one of the largest of local newsrooms in a single metropolitan area amongst our member network. There's organizations not represented on stage here. There's Cicero Independiente, Southside Weekly, Block Club Chicago, Better Government Association. The list goes on. There's so many. And newsrooms in Chicago have really been the leaders in innovation when it comes to local news, particularly driven by startups that are creating new forms of news participation and engagement, and now a historic merger between WBEZ and the Sun-Times. So I want to start with just a question to Bettina. Can you tell us a little bit of what you've seen change in the Chicago landscape since City Bureau began in 2015? And ultimately, do you feel like residents are better served by all these changes and growth that's happening?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about Chicago and the awesome news media that's happening here with so many people who do work that I admire. So I just want to say, you know, when City Bureau started in 2015, there were just 4 of us. It was an all volunteer staff. We all had our other full-time jobs in media. And so we're coming from the perspective of, you know, looking at the media landscape. What else does Chicago need in order to really benefit from, you know, to be able to fully participate in the city? When I talk to people, sometimes at news conferences, you know, they'll be like, oh, Chicago, it's a 2-paper town. Y'all are so lucky you still have 2 papers. And I'm like, wait, we've got more than 100 papers in Chicago, right? Like the Chicago news ecosystem, even in 2015, was extremely, extremely broad. I think what I would say that's happened since then, you know, should not be a surprise to anyone in the room. There has been consolidation and layoffs in the biggest players in the city. You know, I'm sure everybody sort of watched the long sort of epic that was the Chicago Tribune, which is a company that I used to work in. And there are a lot of super talented journalists in Chicago who, during a particular period of time, were sort of thinking to themselves, like, what am I going to do with myself? Because I love journalism. I love Chicago, I want to be working in this great city and doing this thing that I really believe in. But maybe I want to do it a little bit differently from some of the other places that I've previously worked in. And that's really what City Bureau was. We co-founded this organization to find ways to create new pathways into the journalism industry for people who are historically have been left out of it. And also to make sure that journalism orgs are speaking and engaging more closely on the ground with communities, especially communities of color in the case of City Bureau, to be able to make sure the work that we're doing is actually relevant and impactful for folks.
Yeah, and you all have carried that vision even outside of the city of Chicago. And I know we previously worked with one another when I was back at WDET in Detroit, and we would look to you all and be like, we have to figure out we were very inspired by the approach that you all were taking, and it's had this ripple effect even outside of the city. This is a question to any of you and all of you, but what are some other changes that you've noticed in the news ecosystem over the last, let's say 5 years? And why do you think Chicago is this place where all this experimentation and evolution in local news is happening? What sort of what's the magic sauce you guys have got going for you?
So Courtney, I can start out. So on the first part of that question about changes in the news ecosystem, now I've only been in Chicago for going on now 4 years, but I will say, just in general, the number of journalists, Bettina mentioned that earlier about some of the things that have happened in the journalism industry, not just locally, but around the country. So the number of journalists, is at least half the size, but I think the ecosystem itself, the ecosystem is stronger. It's stronger because of some of the innovations. So I'd love that, when a lot of journalists left some of the big papers because of layoffs and other declines, that those people really kind of figured out ways to create some of those new startups. So I think the ecosystem is more innovative. I also think it's less competitive and it's like more community. I think we all recognize that the importance of democracy and the role and, the responsibility that we have as news organizations in upholding those democratic systems and values. So I think that has made us more cooperative and more collaborative. 15 years ago, you would rarely see news organizations playing ball together, even though a lot of the journalists were friends. And so I do think that has really kind of changed it. And in some ways, it's made it, it allowed us to be more collaborative, but also more experimental. So, and so to the second part of that question, I think, Chicago, why are, this is such a great place for experimentation. Chicago has an unusually high amount of breaking news, I think, that not only gets covered locally, but nationally as well. I remember my first 6 months here was like, oh my goodness, when is the news going to stop? And it was news that was just resonating around the country. It is the third largest city in the country, and it has interesting history and even, current the city government and politics, race relations, the impact of segregation that it's had on communities and some of the government systems, the business hub. So there are so many things, that nationally, from politics to race relation to, crime, that happen here in the city. And so some of those things happen other places, but it's almost like everything happens here in Chicago. And so the fact that, talked earlier about there, like people saying, oh, you still have a major daily newspaper. And there are so many successful other papers and digital outlets like Block Club and Borderless and BGA and City Bureau and on and on. So I think that just invites experimentation between the news and the organizations themselves.
Yeah, if I could just add a little bit more there. So I started in journalism actually at Chicago Public Radio back in 2006. So I saw, when the economy crashed around then, like the first wave of layoffs then, and like how the ecosystem has changed. But I think what Tracy and Bettina said about how we're through this like layoffs and pain points and closures, we're having this rebirth, and there's a lot of excitement and creativity. And, a lot of that is coming from just people cycling. So I started at Chicago Public Radio. I worked with City Bureau for a while. Like I, had all these touch points in our media. And that really informed, Borderless's creation and like the work we do today. We're all inspired by each other. I think the other thing about Chicago, besides it just being big and lots of stories coming out of here, is we're incredibly diverse. We have like all these different languages, people from all different backgrounds, racially, economically, very diverse. So we have a lot of different perspectives. And I think what we were learning, from the downfall of some of these larger news outlets was, there's opportunity to bring some of those voices to the forefront. Borderless, last year we did a report on the state of immigration coverage in Chicago and immigrant community coverage. And what we found in our survey is that more than half of ethnic serving news outlets in Chicago have shut down in the last 10 years. So we're losing a lot of our Spanish language news outlets, our Arabic language, our Filipino language news outlets. And so there's a lot of opportunity there still to fill in those holes as smaller news outlets that have been around for decades in many cases can no longer afford to be there.
One change that is happening kind of across the entire media ecosystem is the transformation of what previously were LLCs or commercial for-profit media news structures transforming into nonprofit. The San Antonio Report is an example. Honolulu Civil Beat is an example. The Chicago Reader is an example of that. And I'm wondering, Nykia, this question is for you. Now that you operate as a nonprofit, is there anything that essentially changes, or what does that mean for the Sun-Times?
There was a significant change. If you had asked me this a year and a half ago, I think I would have had a different response. I was having speeches around the country at specific business schools and talking about the importance of journalism and telling people to subscribe. But in today's world, philanthropic giving is really that what we call risk capital that is injected into journalism that has not been able to do it before. The problem with for-profit news organizations for the most part is, as a collective, we have waited too long to try to solve the problem. And so when you have this tsunami of funds and thought partnership coming with those funds from philanthropy, it completely changes the landscape. It buys you time to fix the economics. It buys you time to then go out into the community and remind them why we are important. What is interesting is over the last, I want to say 20 plus years, you've got a lot of the larger players who are much more reliant, for example, on advertising income. There are lots of organizations out there that have 60% of their revenues that are tied to advertising. And when all of that left to go to the social media platforms, all of a sudden 60 cents for every dollar that you bring in is gone. And so it's an emergency to try to come back and figure out the economics. What the nonprofit model does is it buys us time to right size those economics. It buys us time to go out to advertising partners, reintroduce ourselves in a way that is much more community driven and community centric, therefore making it a community good. So a year and a half ago, I would have been crying, but today it really is sort of the best thing that has happened to the Chicago Sun-Times. And opportunities like this, when you are in that not-for-profit model, while it is competitive in some sorts because each outlet has to figure out how to survive with their own underlying economics, there's that overarching understanding of much more collaboration. There's thought partnership just in this call right here. There's understanding what's happening in the ecosystem nationally, locally, and everyone being able to share ideas to lift an industry that was really on life support and facing extinction.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting. And I know, Nissa, like you're coming at it from a completely different angle, right? Like you, I think might be the youngest organization on the stage right now, but you were founded as a nonprofit. organization. You started as a nonprofit organization. So walk us through maybe your approach as to why did you launch as a nonprofit in comparison to a for-profit? What about your work is different in any way? And who is really served by the work that you do at Borderless?
Yeah. And I mean, even before we incorporated as a nonprofit, we were similarly to City Bureau working as volunteers and just a group of people who saw a problem really in response to the Muslim travel ban and the media's coverage or lack of coverage around it. And we saw a problem and we tried to fix it with the tool we had, which was journalism. So our initial start was really just as a Medium blog in 2017, myself and 2 other Chicago journalists. We all had day jobs, we all had multiple jobs, and just trying to put the journalism out there and fill a gap. And then it wasn't until, a few months in that we were like, this needs to be something permanent. There's a need for something like this. So we made the decision to become a nonprofit because it was so mission driven from the start, and really mission, not just about the reporting and doing the reporting on immigration and immigrant communities, but really reimagining what immigration journalism could look like and taking an ecosystem approach. So today we have 3 programs. We have our reporting, we publish on borderlessmag.org. We have our Pathways program, which is providing mentoring, internship fellowships for journalists from immigrant backgrounds. And then we have our immigration reporting lab where we're training and providing best practice resources and doing some consulting with news outlets who want to, for example, do Spanish language journalism or reach more immigrants in their community. So we really, it's like an ecosystem approach. And, as I think, we are the youngest, so we've been publishing in this form since October 2019, so about 2.5 years. Our team is really, unique in this field. Our team speaks 8 different languages. 99% of our stories last year were written, photographed, or illustrated by immigrants or the children of immigrants. So we're very much not just about reporting on immigrants, but with immigrants, by immigrants, for immigrants. And on that note, we are fully bilingual Spanish-English. We also just started publishing in Dari for our Afghan refugee population here. And 45% of our online audience reads our stories in Spanish. So it's a good portion of our audience that's not reading in English. And lest you think we're some huge company that we can do all this, we have 3 full-time staff and at the moment 2 part-time staff and 3 Pathways fellows and interns. So we're really small, and we're really just leveraging people's experience and backgrounds to do this kind of different kind of reporting that's very human-centered and from the ground up. And again, we take a very ecosystem approach, much like City Bureau. You can tell that I used to work with Bettina, very inspired. But at the same time, again, borrowing things from other news outlets and really taking inspiration from our region.
I think that echoes the conversation we just had with Carol Coletta about, the reimagining of public spaces, is that there's this call to action of not just saving what used to be in journalism or in public spaces, but reimagining of what it needs to be, right, for today. And I think that all of you on this stage are doing that, and addressing that transformation. Like Nykia, I heard in your response, it's about, we need to expand this opportunity for evolution, and we need some runway to figure out how we reorganize and how we reshift. And Nissa, I hear you saying we're going to start and serve this gap, and we're going to do it. It's not just about delivering the news, it's training, it's fellowships, it's all these things that sit around your ability to do that you're addressing.
Well, Courtney, and one other thing, just honestly, when we talk about the strength of the ecosystem, what it essentially says from an economic perspective is you continue to have fragmentation in the industry when people feel that they can do a better job than what's there, right? So maybe people left organizations because the lack of leadership or the lack of vision. They had that vision, they had their cohort, and they were able to go off and run. And so that is where I think experimentation, innovation, and really the rising tide that raises all boats is really going to help Chicago continue to be a very strong media market.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have to agree. And I think that like a lot of people look at fragmentation and it worries them because so much of our industry was originally built on who can get the biggest, the fastest. Moving away from the for-profit model, moving away from the advertiser-driven model is not just good for people who, you know, for equity and just all the different missions, the beautiful missions that exist when we look at nonprofit journalism. It's also good for on the audience side of things and the incentive to test solutions. If we do get money from philanthropy, if we do get money directly from folks who want to support our work, it's not just do you have a lot of eyeballs. We can serve niche audiences the way that they need to be served. You know, we, as Nissa mentioned, we're such a diverse city. There are so many different people who get news in different ways, who prefer to learn in different ways. Mm-hmm. And the nonprofit model allows us to fund this incentive to test solutions, because a nonprofit funder might say, try out this solution. Even if it doesn't work, I will personally consider it a good thing. And that is just not something that happened in the for-profit model.
I think what I hear you all saying is that, okay, if our end game is to serve everyone in Chicago, right? There's not one single newsroom that can do that. You need an ecosystem of small and large. You need an ecosystem of people reaching different types of audiences. You need a diversity of those resources and those outlets to really lift all boats. Nykia, were you going to ask?
Yes, especially as it relates to news, right? There are industries where you could argue that fragmentation is bad. News is information. It is how people navigate their quality of life and on and on and on, right? And so because this is how people move around, this is shining a light on the cracks in democracy. It's continuing to have people who are the first draft writers of history, right? This is really talking about something that's supposed to be here today, last for many years to come and centuries to come, because it is that fourth estate. It does have a different feel for when you're talking about fragmentation, collaboration, and or competition.
Right. Okay. So like Borderless, you know, another thing we see happening both in Chicago and in the ecosystem at large is that the startups that have been founded within the last 5 years, there is this orientation towards the new newsrooms that are beginning, focusing on serving communities of color or serving communities that, you know, there's I'm sure a better term for this, but are traditionally on the outskirts or traditionally underserved by traditional media. But I want to point to Tracy and Nykia and maybe talk from an organization. Your organizations have been around, your established organizations. What are some of the ways in which your organizations are also serving people of color or Spanish-speaking communities, lower income communities in Chicago? What have you seen evolve or transform within your organization itself to meet that need?
So I would say, I mean, the first thing is, you know, just the pretty obvious thing. I mean, we have tried to do a much better job of covering communities and doing stories that really kind of expose the inequities. Whether it's, you know, a big story we did when I first got here on ticketing and towing practices that really targeted, you know, Black and Brown communities, or more recently, a story, you know, on water bill collections that are pushing those same communities deep into debt, or a story that the Sun-Times recently did about the toll of drug arrests. But, you know, we have to recognize that it's not just enough to create impactful content and pat ourselves on the back when we win awards, or even, you know, when our stories are able to impact change. And so we have to make sure that the people whose lives are impacted, you know, by our work actually get to see it and experience that coverage and have access to some of the resources that come as a result of that. And so we recently did, and as one just example, I think, of how how we want to move forward in doing things and evolving and doing things differently. So we recently did, I mentioned we call it our water debt series. It's by Maria Zamudio. And so when we did that story, there was a big investigation, and we found that 60% of the people in the city of Chicago who were in, collections because they couldn't afford to pay their water bill were people from Black and Brown communities. And so that story started out at the very beginning, being rooted in the community of Maria, just going literally door to door, knocking on people's doors and talking to them and trying to identify who those people were. So the story ran in the Sunday edition of the Sun-Times. We also sent postcards out to every address that we had for people who were in collections, translated the story in shorter versions in Spanish. And then after the story ran, both in BEZ and the Sun-Times, we started holding workshops in communities. So we've done 2 so far. We did one that was in a mostly Black neighborhood. And then just this past weekend, we had one in Little Village, which is predominantly, to reach Spanish-speaking audiences. And the event was a Spanish-speaking event, and that was then translated into English instead of vice versa. And so community engagement has really become key to us in the way that we cover stories before, during, and after, especially some of the bigger investigations at Enterprise. So I think, for us, we're evolving to where we are really having the community to drive more, to tell us, what stories are important to them and what issues that, are resonating with them, especially in the election period. So I think, to me, that is the biggest change. And we went from having a small event staff to now we have a 5-person team that does community engagement. And we're working very closely with the Sun-Times to, have even bigger impact. So.
And Tracy, the only thing that I would add to that is, so you started, I think, the story in box 1. Box 0 is your leadership. Box 0 is the leadership that we have at the Chicago Sun-Times and Chicago Public Media and our boards that are really pushing diversity, right? The you and I being here, being able to talk about our communities in ways that are sensitive, that make sense. Therefore, when we go into them, we are not imposters, but we are partners. And so starting in the newsroom, thinking about diversity, thinking about underserved communities, really working towards having a workforce that reflects the community, then we're able to go out and amplify that voice. So that's really started with your leadership and sensitivity.
Yeah, I would add that that's one more benefit of the nonprofit model, right? Because, at the time this is not the first time in the history of media that people have been like, let's make our newsrooms more diverse. This was like a goal that ASNI set in like 1960. And they were like, let's get to parity by 2000. I think what's really different about the conversation and what is embodied by what Tracy and Nykia were saying is that with the nonprofit model, the need for diversity is not like, oh, we can make more money if we are more diverse. It's not like we can attract more advertisers. It's much more to the core of the board of directors, leadership, goal setting, strategic planning that says like, this is core to our success. Even if we make a bunch of money and we're not reaching communities of color, that is still not success for us. And that is so much more sustainable of a way to do this kind of anti-racism diversity work than the way that it was done back in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. And it begs me, to ask, like, is there any way in which your work is influenced by one another? Like, would City Bureau or organizations like Borderless or Black Club exist if it wasn't for the Sun-Times or WBEZ, or vice versa? Would WBEZ be approaching their work this way if there wasn't a Black Club or a Borderless in your community? In which ways are you all inspired and sort of interdependent on one another? And are there things that, because the ecosystem is the way it is, where there are all these diversity of outlets that exist, that it empowers what you're able to achieve individually as an organization?
Yeah, because you get the best of, right? So no one can do, the funny thing is I was just sending Tracy a text message saying, we need to partner with these people on the phone. And she's like, we already do. I'm like, okay, right? So in a for-profit world, you more likely have your elbows up. But in this sort of fragmented opportunity, you get the best of. And so no one can do it better than Borderless if they are really doubling down, for example, on immigration and those types of things. No one can do it better than City Bureau, getting experts from around the city and really doing this because it's a labor of love and something that they really want to be able to amplify. And so instead of having to continue to grow our newsroom in ways that is duplicative, we get to grow in ways that are not duplicative and therefore leverage the best of around the city.
Right. That I will add, even though, we shared stories sometimes with Borderless and done a big investigative project with City Bureau, there's a lot more, to Nykia's point, of work that we can do together. I think a lot of us are already a part of a big collaboration called Solving for Chicago. There are like 22 news organizations throughout Chicago that work with the local media association through a project through them that's called Solving for Chicago, where we come together and collaborate and share, and I love that. But let me say this though, no news organization or journalist enjoy getting beat or scooped on a story, but nonetheless we have just a lot of respect for the work that we all do, and it does make us all better. And yes, it's actually inspiring. When Blood Club broke the story on improper vaccinations at Loretta Hospital, that was inspiring. When the BGA and the Chicago Trib recently won a Pulitzer for local reporting on fire safety, that was inspiring. And I remember someone asking me, like, how do you feel about that? And I think they thought I was going to, say something negative about the Trib. I'm like, that's pretty awesome. The Trib has had a tough few years. And, to work with, collaborate with the Better Government Association and to land, a Pulitzer Award during what has been one of its most difficult periods. Like, would I have, like for, that to be us? Certainly. But I'm glad that it's someone, and ultimately it's, again, not just about the awards. It is about the work and the impact of the work. And that is what is inspiring.
Yeah, what I've learned through doing this work in Chicago, and then for those of you who don't know, City Bureau runs a program called Documenters that trains and pays residents to attend public meetings. This is one of our really big programs, and we've also been spreading it to different cities across the country, including Detroit, which Courtney knows, other places like Cleveland, Minneapolis. And what I've learned is that, by working, we don't take our program and just drop it in a different city and say like, hey, this program is going to work great in Detroit, right? We work really, really closely with both community groups and newsrooms on the ground in the other city who can sort of define success and who can define what are the pros and cons of taking this program there. And what I've learned through doing that and talking to our partners in other cities is that the fact that Chicago has like big institutions that do cover breaking news all the time, who do make sure that the bases are covered, that like if there is a scandal going on, that they're going to show up and they're going to be holding a microphone in someone's face, that gives City Bureau an opportunity to focus on other things that, we might be better at compared to the breaking news. And so to me, 100% like we get to do the best of, just like Nykia said, because of our focus. And also, this is, I think it's a lesson that like a lot of people can learn about like the nature of collaboration in a local news ecosystem. What I heard from folks at the Collaborative Journalism Summit, which was in Chicago a couple weeks ago, is that, in order to do good collaboration, you have to be really open and honest about what you're great at and what you're not so great at, and then have your partners fill in for those other parts.
I would be remiss not to talk about sustainability. And when you have fragmentation, how do you sustain it? I mean, I think that's one of the challenges of a fragmented news ecosystem. It meets the need of, it better, in today's day and age, better meets the need of residents, but it's also challenging to sustain, financially. So as we wrap, I just want to do like sort of a round robin, and Nissa, we'll start with you, but if you each could just share, what do you see as the greatest challenge, and what do you see as the greatest opportunity to sustain this ecosystem? You can think of this in terms of cash and door, right? Because in the world of philanthropy, there's not nearly enough of philanthropy supporting news to really meet the need of all of the nonprofit news organizations that need it, that are doing great work. It could be in the form of audience. It could be in the form of talent. Like, how do you build this ecosystem in a way that is sustainable? So, challenge, opportunity. Nissa, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So I think when I think of challenge, I think just time. You know, the previous ecosystem that we think of in Chicago as a 2-newspaper town, which, as Bettina said, was never actually true. But, you know, that's what we thought of as the ecosystem. That had decades to build and create and experiment and figure out things. You know, the new outlets that are coming up are only a few years old. So I think, you know, the challenge is just making sure we have that time to experiment, and that people don't, you know, give up on us too early. Foundations don't give up. Oh, you're only, you know, a couple of years, where the Tribune has decades, you know, to figure these things out. So I think part of that is money, but also just time. That, like, we're all baby organizations, at least City Bureau and Borderless. And, like, I can only imagine, like, what will look like in 20, 40 years. I think it will be amazing. I'm super excited. And I think, you know, as far as opportunities, you know, I think from the Borderless perspective, really, we've been thinking a lot about translation and, you know, how do we reach communities that are just really not connected to the news at all right now, at least the news and in how we see it, like traditional news, like TV, radio, newspaper. And one of the things we're doing now is experimenting with field canvassers going out in Spanish language or Spanish-speaking communities here in Chicago to really connect with them, seeing where they're getting their news from. And it's often like churches and community groups, and trying to fill in those gaps in new and creative ways, whether that's, you know, through comics like we've done. So I think there's so much opportunity to reach folks who are disconnected from the news, and specifically people who don't speak English, which in Chicago is a huge population.
Nykia, I want to pass the mic to you. Challenges and opportunities to sustaining.
Absolutely. I am very, very bullish and optimistic on the future sustainability. And the reason is because I'm coming from a legacy organization that was on life support that we had to turn around, where 70% of the revenues was still from a paper product. And so if I were a business person today that had to manage something up and coming, if I were in Nissa's shoes or even in Bettina's shoes, the advantage is you grow slowly, right? So you don't go and you don't bank the farm on potential advertising revenues that may come and may go, right? You understand the volatility and the fragility of your profit and loss statement up front. So if you don't have the income, you don't grow, you get super creative and innovative in-house. And so if organizations can grow slow and really manage the profit and loss statement, and really then be able to discuss to foundations and potential donors and subscribers, members, however you want to define it, I think their path to the future is easier. Bigger companies in the past, oh, we're big, we're too big to fail, all of that. And of course, that has been proven significantly wrong. And once some type of economic downturn came and the advertisers left, everyone was sort of, you could tell who was swimming naked when the tide came in, right? So I'm super optimistic about the future of going slow, doubling down on what you're good at, and seeing what happens from there.
Thank you. If I could, I want to interject at least one audience question, because I know we're wrapping up. There's a question in here about like your funding pie, and I'm not sure if it differs between all of you. But Jeff asked, where do you get the bulk of your funding? Foundations, grants, private donations, or other nonprofits with similar objectives, and any other unusual sources? Are any of you all tapping into things outside of grants and foundations?
We do some consulting, and like we've run translation programs for local Chicago news outlets, and doing training programs for journalists, professional journalists. So that is one space, and we also have done merch before. I think someone from Borderless, Jen, threw in a link to our current T-shirt campaign.
I love my Borderless merch. City Bureau, in addition to foundations and individual donations, we also have business revenue from the work that we do in documenters, in licensing our the digital tools, along with like, the trainings and all of the stuff that we make that program possible.
And for the Chicago Sun-Times, it's more conspiracy of circumstance than design.
Mhm.
But our for-profit model that we left 130 days ago had already trained people to pay something for news.
Mm-hmm.
Now they weren't paying full freight, right? Because advertising was subsidizing that. So because we already had a very strong cohort of citizens who understand that they should pay something, that has sort of helped sustain us in the short term.
And then I'll just add that in addition to donors and, philanthropic organizations that give to us, at least half of our income really comes through. And it's interesting because we're doing a pledge drive this week, come from people who, members who donate, whether it's $5 a month or $500.
Mm-hmm.
So that's still, an important and sustainable model for us in public radio.
Thank you. We've got 2 minutes left, and I just wanted to give Bettina and Tracy, you all, a chance to respond to that last question of just challenges and opportunities, and quickly, and then we will wrap up. So, Tracy?
Yeah, so I'll just say, I think for me, the greatest challenge is also the greatest opportunity. So I think it's relevance and audience, being relevant in people's lives and the audience that's out there that is not being met right now. So it's a challenge, and how do we reach those people? But it's also, I think, our greatest opportunity as well to figure out, I think Bettina mentioned earlier about how, we shouldn't and can't serve everybody. And there are smaller groups that we can be very intentional about going to and creating, news products that actually serve, very targeted demographics. So I think that's an opportunity for us.
Yeah, I would say that, at City Bureau and for the folks that we work really closely with, what I've learned, especially from people from the community organizing side, is that in order to do the type of work that we do, which is really grounded in equity, you really have to operate from a place of abundance. You can't be always thinking like, where am I going to do, how am I going to continue to do this? Because we are looking at, a lot of challenges when it comes to how are we going to get information to those who are the most deeply affected by the issues that we cover, right? So you operate from a place of abundance, not only in news producers. City Bureau considers every person who lives in Chicago to be a possible news producer who has a story to tell, who has the ability, given the right circumstances, to distinguish fact from fiction and to share that information from their neighbors in a very trustworthy way. And that goes into, not just news producers, but also news consumers, right? There are, the slice of the pie of people who actually consume news in Chicago is much, much smaller than the number of people who live in Chicago. There's so many people in Chicago who just don't find news that's relevant to them, or maybe they haven't been exposed to it. And so how do we, galvanize this more grassroots movement around local news information, being involved civically, whether it's through your local community group and you just hear the news from like the abuela down the street, or if you're learning it, directly from a news organization, you're going to a workshop that Borderless has put on, you're attending a WBEZ Sun-Times event, or you're coming to a City Bureau public newsroom. I think you need to operate from that place of abundance in order to manifest what we need, which is a much more broad-based coalition of people who care about local news and information.
That is great. Thank you so much, Bettina, Nissa, Nykia, and Tracy. I really like where you all have left off this conversation, which really is this charge and call to action of expanding our reach and our access within our communities, and also expanding the pie at large, and figuring out ways where philanthropy, individual donors, or businesses can step in to really support this. But it all starts with it being meaningful first to the people that live in Chicago and that need it. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.